Imagine for a second, right, that you're just standing on an assembly line somewhere in North America, and you're watching a brand new car being built. I mean, you might think it starts as like a steel frame in one factory, gets its doors bolted on, and engine dropped in.
Right, the traditional Henry Ford model.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And then it just rolls out the door to your local dealership.
Yeah.
But the reality is actually mind-boggling.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Because before that single vehicle is finally finished, its individual parts, the transmission, the microchips, the steering column, they might have crossed the United States-Canada border not just once, not twice, but like half a dozen times.
Yeah.
A piece of aluminum gets cast in Quebec, right? Yeah. Then it goes to Michigan to be machined, then to Ontario for assembly, and then back to Ohio to be put into the final car.
Right.
It is a masterclass in deep, seamless integration. Or, well, I guess at least it used to be.
Yeah, it used to be. I mean, that back and forth movement, it was completely frictionless for the better part of a century. It was literally the defining feature of the North American economy. And it was all built on this assumption that geography and shared infrastructure made free trade an absolute necessity.
Well, welcome to today's Deep Dives, everyone. We are taking you on a journey into a complex geopolitical and economic crisis that has, honestly, fundamentally shattered that frictionless world.
Yeah, it really has.
We're unpacking a recent, incredibly detailed paper by Fareed Novin, and this was published in the Global Review on May 10th, 2026.
Right.
So our mission today is to understand the severe deterioration of U.S.-Canada trade relations, this whole tariff warfare of 2025 and 2026, and the emerging crisis surrounding the CUSMA trade agreement.
Because we are looking at the unraveling of, one of the most stable bilateral relationships on the planet.
Yeah.
And the ripple effects of this are altering global supply chains, energy security, and even, and we'll get into this, how Western democracies deal with adversaries like China.
Right, totally. Now, before we get into the mechanics of all this, a quick note to you, our listener, because we are looking at very recent, highly charged political moves by both the second Trump administration and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. And I want to be really clear here. Our job today isn't to pick sides or, play pundit.
Exactly.
We are strictly looking under the hood of this paper to impartially report the facts, the events, and the arguments exactly as they are presented in the source text.
Yeah, just looking at the mechanics.
Right. Neither of us are endorsing any political viewpoints here. We just want to map out how the mechanics of this trade war actually work so you can make sense of the headlines.
Because the goal is to provide clarity, right, on the mechanisms of trade, the legal battles, and the strategic shifts, stripping away all that political rhetoric to see what is structurally happening to the continent.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Let's start with that baseline of integration you mentioned. We have this historical nervous system of trade parts zooming across the border, billions of dollars flowing daily. That didn't happen by accident, did it?
No, not at all. I mean, the paper traces this all the way back to the 1965 Auto Pact.
Right.
Which essentially, erased the border for automotive manufacturing. And then came the 1988 Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA in 1994, and finally CUSMA in 2020.
Right. So decades of building this up.
Exactly. Both countries basically operated under the shared assumption that open borders were a mutual benefit. But, and this is a big but, the paper points out that starting in 2025, the very definition of what a tariff is fundamentally changed.
Wait, changed how? Like, what was it before?
Well, historically, a tariff is an economic tool, right? If you want to protect American steel workers from being undercut by cheap imported steel, you put a tariff on foreign steel to level the playing field.
Okay, yeah, targeted protectionism.
Right. But the administration transformed tariffs into these central instruments of political coercion and domestic signaling. So Washington began framing trade through a zero-sum logic. The new expectation was that allies had to make specific political concessions just to maintain their market access.
So they weren't just protecting American factories anymore.
Wow.
They were essentially saying, if you don't do X on immigration or Y on drug enforcement, we're going to tax your aluminum.
Exactly. Tariffs became diplomatic threats. And to do this, they relied really heavily on this specific piece of legislation called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
Okay, wait. IEPA. Need some help here, because my understanding is that IEPA was designed for actual, national security emergency.
Yeah, that's the intent.
Like freezing the bank accounts of terrorist organizations or sanctioning hostile nations, right?
Yes.
So how does a president use the national security law to slap tariffs on, like lumber or car parts from an allied neighbor?
Well, by stretching the definition of an emergency to its absolute breaking point. Yeah. The White House began interpreting this law incredibly expansively. They argued that chronic issues like trade imbalances, fentanyl trafficking, and generalized border concerns, they argued those constituted immediate national emergencies.
Ah.
And by classifying these systemic issues as emergencies, the executive branch could invoke IEEPA to bypass Congress entirely.
Oh, because normally Congress does that.
Exactly. Normally, Congress controls trade and taxation. But IEPA allowed the administration to unilaterally slap sweeping tariffs directly on Canada with literally just the stroke of a pen.
Man, I mean, it sounds like using a fire extinguisher to hammer in a nail.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, like you're grabbing a tool designed for a raging acute crisis,
Yeah.
and you're using it as a daily diplomatic bludgeon to force political concessions out of one of your closest allies.
Yeah, and that strategy relied entirely on psychological dominance. The United States operated on this assumption that it possessed overwhelming economic leverage.
Which, I mean, historically they kind of did, right?
Right, because Canada historically sent about 3/4 of its exports to the U.S. So the administration's calculation was that Canada was so disproportionately dependent on the American market that they would just have to submit.
They had no choice.
Exactly. The strategy was designed to make American power seem irresistible.
But, and this is where things get really crazy, relying on a creative interpretation of an emergency law just to bypass Congress. I mean, that inherently carries a massive legal risk.
Oh, absolutely.
You're essentially daring the judicial system to stop you. And according to the paper, in February 2026, that risk blew up the entire strategy in just a spectacular way.
Yes, the Supreme Court case.
Right. This landmark ruling, Learning Resources, Inc. Trump. But wait, so I always understood tariffs as a tool to regulate trade. But this paper is saying the Supreme Court treated these specific tariffs like taxes.
Yeah.
How does a trade tool legally cross the line into a tax?
It all comes down to the primary purpose of the financial penalty. So the Supreme Court looked at the administration's really expansive use of IEPA, and they basically pulled the emergency brake. They ruled that if a tariff is applied so broadly that its primary function isn't just to protect a specific domestic industry,
Right.
but rather to raise general revenue or penalize a massive broad swath of the economy, then it fundamentally constitutes a tax.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And according to the origination clause of the U.S. Constitution, the power to levy taxes resides exclusively with Congress, not the executive branch.
Ah, so they overstepped.
Big time.
Mhm.
The court concluded that IAPA simply did not contain explicit authorization for the president to impose these kinds of broad-based coercive tariffs.
So overnight, the legal foundation for this entire coercive strategy just vanishes?
Yep.
The fire extinguisher is taken away?
Exactly.
Right.
The ruling instantly invalidated numerous tariffs that had been imposed on Canada, but honestly, the fallout was profoundly psychological.
So.
Well, the administration had built its entire geopolitical posture on the perception that it could deploy these tariffs rapidly and unilaterally. And once the Supreme Court constrained that authority, the aura of inevitability surrounding American economic coercion just completely collapsed.
I mean, if the whole point of this tariff campaign was to project overwhelming strength, to be unpredictable and dominant,
Yeah.
doesn't getting shot down by your own Supreme Court expose a massive glass jaw?
Oh, completely.
Like, if I know your weapon is going to be confiscated by the courts the second you try to use it, the threat is totally neutralized, why would I ever concede to your demands?
Well, and what's fascinating here is that the international community had the exact same realization.
Right.
The ruling exposed the structural fragility of this executive-centered trade coercion. Allies suddenly recognized that these tariff threats lacked durable legal foundations.
They called the bluff.
Exactly. And to compound the damage, the silence from the Oval Office following the ruling was deafening. Yeah, usually you'd see a rapid, aggressive counter-narrative, but the absence of one signaled deep internal strategic disarray.
And then you have the sudden recall of the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Huckstra, right back to Washington.
Right.
Now, I mean, diplomatic recalls can mean a lot of things: strategic reassessment, crisis management, political damage control. But happening right amid these escalating legal defeats, it just broadcasted to the globe that Washington was struggling to formulate a coherent response.
And Canada recognized this vulnerability immediately,
Yeah.
which is key because this represents a major departure from how Canada historically handled trade disputes with the U.S.
Normally they're pretty quiet about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For decades, Canada played the role of the quiet, technocratic negotiator. They'd get into a room, go sector by sector, and try to find a polite compromise just to keep the borders open and the supply chains moving.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Instead of that, Prime Minister Mark Carney adopted a radically different approach.
Yeah, he did.
Canada essentially stopped playing the role of the loyal, quiet sidekick.
Oh.
It's like they realized they were holding a stock portfolio that was 90% invested in one incredibly volatile company.
Right.
And instead of just hoping the stock price would stabilize, Carney decided it was time to aggressively diversify their assets.
Yeah.
Like instead of just taking the hit, they walked out of the room and started building their own global Avengers team of trade partners to call out the U.S.
That's a great analogy. Drawing heavily on his background in international finance and central banking, Carney pursued this multidimensional geopolitical response. He essentially refused to accept Washington's premise that these tariffs were just legitimate bilateral bargaining tools. Instead, Ottawa explicitly reframed the American tariffs as a direct threat to the entire rules-based international economic order.
Wow. So by doing that, they aren't just complaining to the world, hey, look what the U.S. is doing to Canada.
Yeah.
They're broadcasting a global warning. If the United States can successfully weaponize market access against its closest, most integrated neighbor, then no middle power anywhere in the world is safe. Your institutional trade guarantees mean nothing.
Exactly. Canada successfully internationalized the dispute. They made the U.S. look globally coercive. And they built sympathy and strategic coordination with the European Union, with Indo-Pacific democracies, and within the G7.
That's huge.
It was. And alongside this rhetorical shift, they leaned heavily into the diversification you mentioned, that whole Avengers team idea.
Yeah.
Ottawa intensified efforts to expand trade relations through massive existing agreements. They utilized CETA, which is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, and the CPTPP, this massive free trade bloc with Asia-Pacific economies.
So they basically activated these giant economic lifeboats they had been building for years.
Right.
I mean, they knew geography makes it impossible to completely replace the U.S. market. You can't just put 1 million cars on a boat to Europe as cheaply as you can drive them to Ohio.
No, of course not.
But the goal was to reduce that asymmetrical vulnerability. And they also pushed this massive domestic industrial policy, right? Focusing on mining critical minerals needed for the future, ramping up electric vehicle production, and heavily asserting their Arctic sovereignty to secure maritime trade routes.
Yeah, they made themselves too valuable to be bullied. But, there is a darker, more permanent consequence to this response, particularly for the bilateral relationship.
What do you mean?
The paper notes this massive psychological shift among the Canadian public. Yeah. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship rested on deep social trust and cultural familiarity. You could easily argue it was the most trusting border in the world.
For sure.
But the repeated tariff escalation, the aggressive rhetoric from American officials, and the perceived disrespect toward Canadian sovereignty, it caused that trust to just evaporate.
Wow.
The paper tracks a significant rise in anti-American sentiment within Canada. The fundamental belief that disputes would always be managed cooperatively was essentially shattered.
Well, let's ground this for you, the person listening right now, because this kind of diplomatic chest bumping doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It hits your wallet.
Absolutely.
Let's look at those ripple effects. When we talk about supply chain fragmentation, what does that actually mean for the everyday consumer?
Okay, so let's go back to that car transmission crossing the border.
Yeah.
When an automotive factory in Michigan doesn't know if the aluminum coming from Quebec is going to be slapped with a 25% tariff next Tuesday via some executive order, they pause their operations.
Because the math doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. Multinational firms hesitate to commit long-term capital, they stop hiring, they delay building new facilities.
Right.
And that uncertainty forces companies to duplicate supply chains, which destroys efficiency. And reduced competitiveness ultimately leads to inflationary pressures. The cost of manufacturing goes up, so the price tag on the dealership lot goes up.
And it's not just manufacturing, is it?
Yeah.
Like if you're wondering why your heating bill might spike this winter, you have to look at the energy vulnerability that Novin outlines in the paper.
Energy interdependence is massive. Canada is among the largest foreign suppliers of oil, natural gas, electricity, and uranium to the U.S.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, American energy security is deeply dependent on Canadian exports just keeping the lights on in major U.S. cities. But conversely, Canada relies heavily on U.S. refining capacity and pipeline infrastructure to actually process and move its raw resources.
Right.
So it's a profound mutual vulnerability. Politicizing this interdependence risks turning one of the most stable pillars of daily life into a strategic battleground.
Well, so I want to ask you about the broader logic of the U.S. strategy here, specifically regarding the geopolitical implications with China. The paper talks about this China paradox.
Yes.
If Washington's top priority globally is competing with Beijing-like securing supply chains, dominating electric vehicle and semiconductor manufacturing, aren't they actively shooting themselves in the foot by starting a trade war with the exact allies they need for that coalition?
The contradiction is glaring.
Right.
Well,
Because you need Canadian critical minerals to build those batteries.
exactly. Washington increasingly expects its allies to align with its industrial and technological containment strategies against Beijing. They want this united Western front. But you cannot build a stable anti-China economic coalition while simultaneously undermining allied trust through tariff coercion.
Yeah, you can't ask someone to watch your back in a bar fight while
Yeah.
you're actively picking their pocket.
That's spot on. When the U.S. treats its allies like adversaries, Western economic unity fragments.
Makes sense.
And middle powers like Canada are suddenly incentivized to hedge their bets. They have to protect their domestic industries and avoid overdependence on either superpower.
Right.
Which means they might remain neutral on key technological embargoes or supply chain shifts that the U.S. desperately wants them to join. This significantly damages American global leadership.
Wow.
If allies perceive the U.S. as an unpredictable and coercive partner, confidence in American-led institutions inevitably weakens.
Right. And this entire cascade of economic pain, fractured trust, and international hedging leads us to the ticking time bomb at the center of this crisis.
The CUSMA trade agreement itself.
Yes. When CUSMA replaced NAFTA in 2020, it was supposed to modernize and stabilize North American trade. But the paper points out it has this structural weakness built right into it, a mandatory sunset review clause.
Yep.
Can you explain the mechanics of how a sunset clause actually functions and why it's functioning less like a safety net and more like a geopolitical pressure cooker right now?
Sure. So a sunset clause basically means the entire trade agreement automatically expires after a certain number of years unless all three countries actively vote to renew it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So rather than guaranteeing stability, this clause institutionalizes recurring pressure.
I see.
Think about it. If you're a CEO planning to build a billion-dollar battery plant, you need a 20-year horizon to guarantee a return on your investment.
Right, you need predictability.
Exactly. A sunset clause makes that a massive gamble because the rules of cross-border trade could fundamentally change or vanish entirely in just a few years.
So Washington views the review as this recurring opportunity to hold the agreement hostage and extract new concessions.
Yes.
While Canada views it with deep skepticism because they no longer trust American commitments.
Right.
And the list of contentious issues they have to resolve is massive, right? They're fighting over digital trade, agricultural market access, and what are known as rules of origin.
Yeah, rules of origin are a big sticking point. They dictate the exact percentage of a product that must be manufactured locally within North America to qualify for zero tariffs.
Okay.
So the U.S. wants to aggressively raise those percentages, particularly for electric vehicles, to freeze out any trace of Chinese investment or Chinese-made battery components.
Oh, I see.
And Canada is resisting because retooling their entire supply chain to meet those incredibly stringent local percentages might make their cars too expensive to produce.
Man, so if the old rule book is burning, what does the new one look like?
Well,
Because the paper maps out 3 ways this plays out, right? Ranging from a temps truce to a total continental divorce. Where do we go from here?
so the first possibility the source outlines is called managed stabilization.
Okay.
This is the optimistic path where the U.S. and Canada manage to de-escalate tensions through negotiated compromises. It would require establishing much clearer legal frameworks for when tariffs can actually be used and expanding dispute resolution mechanisms so courts, rather than politicians, settle arguments.
But, I mean, based on everything we've discussed about the evaporation of public trust and all this geopolitical posturing, stabilization seems incredibly difficult.
It does.
You can't just mandate goodwill.
Which brings us to the second, more realistic outcome, permanent strategic friction.
That doesn't sound great.
It's not.
Right.
Under this scenario, tariffs become semi-permanent features of their relationship. We'd see constant low-grade trade disputes. Supply chains would partially regionalize, meaning companies, stop treating the US and Canada as one giant market, and instead build redundant, separate factories in each country just to be safe.
Oh, wow.
The relationship becomes purely transactional. And the paper notes that this is the most likely medium-term outcome.
So a constant low-grade trade war as the new normal.
Yeah.
That means permanently higher prices for consumers and slower economic growth across the board. And the third scenario?
The most severe outcome is continental fragmentation.
Okay.
This involves a partial breakdown of the entire North American trade system. We would see accelerated economic decoupling, where Canadian and American industries actively sever ties.
Whoa.
You'd see massive investment flight away from the border regions, and a strategic realignment where Canada fully anchors its economy to Europe and Asia instead of the U.S.
Do you think that that's actually possible?
Well, while a complete 100% collapse is unlikely simply because the physical power grids and pipelines are so interconnected, the risks of deep fragmentation are growing significantly every single time a new tariff is threatened.
Looking at those three paths, it seems like the ultimate takeaway here is that trade agreements aren't just ink on a page.
Yeah.
Like you can have all the sunset clauses, the intricate legal frameworks, and the complex dispute mechanisms in the world. But if the fundamental expectation of good faith is gone, the whole treaty is just a house of cards.
Exactly. The deterioration of mutual trust is actually far more consequential than the financial costs of the tariffs themselves.
Yeah.
Because for decades, this relationship worked not merely because of formal legal text, but because of shared expectations of predictability and partnership.
Right.
Without that predictability, the very foundation of North American integration crumbles. Firms won't invest, supply chains will reroute, and the economic efficiency that literally defined the continent will be permanently lost.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at a border that was once the definition of frictionless integration. We unpacked how the U.S. weaponized tariffs, stretching emergency powers to use them as a diplomatic bludgeon.
Right.
We saw the Supreme Court dramatically strike that strategy down by redefining those tariffs as unconstitutional taxes, which basically collapsed the U.S.'s aura of inevitability.
Yep.
And then we explored how Canada fundamentally pivoted its global strategy, diversifying its economic portfolio and stepping onto the world stage to build a coalition against economic coercion.
And we traced how that breakdown doesn't just stay in the halls of government.
No, not at all.
It bleeds into global supply chains, spikes the cost of manufacturing, threatens continental energy security, and significantly complicates the broader Western geopolitical competition with China.
And this is exactly why this deep dive matters to you. This isn't abstract political theory happening in a vacuum. This crisis directly impacts the price of the car you drive off the lot, the cost of the energy that heats your home this winter, and honestly, the long-term global stability of the Western world.
Absolutely.
When the rules of international trade become arbitrary, the hidden costs get passed down the assembly line directly to all of us. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own.
Okay.
We have just spent this entire conversation looking at how quickly trust evaporated between two of the closest, most deeply intertwined allies in modern history. If decades of deep, shared economic interdependence wasn't enough to stop the United States and Canada from fracturing under political pressure, what does that mean for trade relations between actual global adversaries?
Yeah.
Can any economic relationship in the 21st century truly survive without fundamental underlying political trust?
It raises a profound question about the future viability of globalization itself. I mean, if friends cannot trade predictably, how can rivals?
Think back to that single vehicle on the assembly line, crossing the border over and over again, completely unbought. That car wasn't just a product of engineering. It was a physical manifestation of profound political trust. And once that trust is gone, the assembly line grinds to a halt. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the shifting sands of global trade. We will see you next time.